Welcome to today's story, a powerful and heart-wrenching account of courage, resilience, and the pursuit of justice. Join us as we delve into Chloe Brooks' journey, an accomplished Black judge whose life took a devastating turn after an unjust and brutal encounter. Her story is one of tragedy, determination, and an unwavering fight against systemic injustice. Chloe Brooks had always considered herself a fighter. At 34 years old, she had built a formidable reputation as a civil rights attorney, navigating a complex world where justice was often selective, especially for people like her. As a Black woman, Chloe knew what it felt like to be seen as other, to be scrutinized in ways her colleagues weren't, and to carry an unspoken weight with each case she took. Yet, this had only fueled her drive. She had dedicated her career to standing up for those whose voices were drowned out, battling for equality in a system that rarely afforded it willingly. When Chloe discovered she was pregnant, it had felt like the start of a new chapter, a soft, hopeful contrast to the relentless fight for justice that defined much of her daily life. She and her husband, Mark, had shared long conversations about the kind of world they hoped to raise their child in. Both of them were all too familiar with the fears that came with raising a Black child in a society where discrimination and judgment often lurked just beneath the surface. Chloe and Mark wanted a different future, a reality where their son could thrive without being shadowed by prejudice or judged by the color of his skin. As the months passed, Chloe embraced the changes that came with her pregnancy. She found herself appreciating the gentler moments of life more deeply. The reassuring kick of her baby, Mark's warm hand resting on her belly, the glow in their home as they prepared to become parents. For Chloe, each quiet evening spent with Mark was a reminder of the love and stability they had built, a foundation she hoped would support their child's future. But even as Chloe adapted to this new reality, she remained acutely aware of the world beyond her front door. The outside world still bore the rough edges of prejudice. In her career, Chloe had encountered plenty of dismissive glances, inappropriate jokes, and outright hostility, all of which she had learned to deflect or endure. Each slight only sharpened her resolve, transforming her anger into a wellspring of determination. Her experiences with discrimination were woven into her journey as a defender of the marginalized, but she held on to the hope that her child might grow up with fewer battles to fight. One quiet Saturday afternoon, Chloe decided to take a break from her demanding schedule. She had just finished a challenging week of cases and felt the need to unwind with something as simple as grocery shopping, a small but grounding task. Mark had offered to go in her place, but Chloe relished these small moments alone, enjoying the simplicity of routine errands as a refreshing departure from the intensity of her work. The day was bright and peaceful, and as Chloe drove through the streets of Riverside, she felt an unexpected sense of calm. The trees lining the roads were bursting with late-season blooms, their colors vibrant against the soft spring sky. Children played in nearby parks, their laughter floating on the breeze, reminding Chloe of the innocence she hoped to preserve for her own child. Arriving at the grocery store, Chloe parked her car and took a moment to breathe deeply, resting her hand on her belly as if to communicate the moment's tranquility to her unborn son. "We're almost there, little one," she whispered, feeling a rush of warmth as she imagined the future. She felt at peace, unguarded, as she made her way toward the entrance. Inside the store, Chloe moved through the aisles, fruits, vegetables, and the familiar staples of their household. She felt a comforting connection to her routine and found herself briefly lost in thoughts of the home-cooked meals she would soon share with her family. As she reached the checkout line, a gentle wave of fatigue reminded her of her body's new demands. Yet she was grateful for this brief escape from her usual reality. But as Chloe placed her items on the counter, her calm was interrupted. Near the end of one aisle, two police officers lingered, their uniforms stark against the store's casual atmosphere. Chloe noticed their presence but thought little of it until she saw one of the officers cast a lingering, suspicious glance in her direction. Chloe tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that settled over her as she caught the officer's gaze. She focused instead on the mundane comfort of grocery shopping, the ordinary act that helped her feel connected to a life that wasn't all about fighting battles. But as she turned back to her cart, the faint hope of slipping back into her calm routine faded. The officer, a tall, heavy-set man with a rigid expression, had started moving in her direction. The store's atmosphere, so warm and welcoming moments before, suddenly seemed to chill. Chloe's heartbeat quickened as the officer's footsteps grew louder. She wasn't a stranger to encounters with law enforcement. As a civil rights attorney, she knew many officers who upheld the law with integrity. But she also knew there were some who acted out of bias. And she'd learned to recognize the tension that accompanied such interactions. The officer stopped a few paces from her, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice echoing with an authority that felt more like accusation than inquiry. Chloe froze, momentarily stunned by the harshness of his tone. She took a breath, then calmly replied, "I'm just here shopping for my family." She spoke evenly, keeping her voice steady despite the surge of discomfort she felt. Her words seemed to do little to ease the officer's suspicion. He looked her up and down, then gave a slight, almost dismissive nod. "You fit a description," he said coldly, his tone suggesting judgment rather than explanation. A flash of anger flickered inside Chloe, but she remained composed, unwilling to escalate the situation. She'd seen this all before, the quick assumptions, the immediate labeling, but now, standing there with her unborn child, the indignity struck her differently. Before she could respond, the officer's partner stepped forward, gripping her arm with surprising force. Chloe recoiled instinctively, alarmed by the sudden contact. "Let go of me," she managed, her voice rising. But her plea only seemed to ignite the officer's aggression. His grip tightened, his expression hardening as he barked, "Stop resisting." Around them, other shoppers began to look on with concern and confusion, their eyes wide as the scene unfolded. Chloe could feel her heart pounding, her fear now mingling with anger. She was a lawyer, not a criminal. She was just a woman shopping. The officer's actions felt as though they were meant to strip her of dignity, of her identity, reducing her to a mere suspect in his eyes. Panic started to wash over her as she struggled, trying to pull free, but the officer held her firmly. Her mind raced, each second feeling like an eternity. She could feel a sharp pain rising in her abdomen, and in that instant, her thoughts turned to her child. She looked into the officer's eyes, pleading, "Please, impregnan. You have to stop." But he remained unmoved, his grip like iron. The world around her blurred, the voices, the noise, the stares, all fading as the pain in her abdomen intensified. Chloe's heart ached with the realization that her life and the life she carried were at the mercy of someone who saw her as nothing more than a threat. Chloe's world went dark. The pain in her abdomen, the chaos of the store, the anger that boiled inside her, it all blurred into one overwhelming sensation. It was as if time had suspended itself. And in the midst of it, the only thing that remained was the sheer terror of what was happening. She could feel the pressure in her body, the tight grip of the officer's hand, and the increasing intensity of the ache in her stomach. It felt like the very life inside her was slipping away. The sounds around her became muffled, as though she were submerged underwater. She could barely hear the frantic calls of the bystanders, the nervous shuffling of feet, the hurried whispers of people witnessing the violence that was unfolding in front of them. Her vision was narrowing, and her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. She knew something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't make her body respond. "Please, stop," she pleaded again, her voice weaker now, barely a whisper. But the officer did not relent. The air in the grocery store was thick with the tension, the sense that something tragic was unfolding. Chloe could feel the life inside her flicker, and in the depths of her fear, she knew this moment was irreversible. She was losing something precious, something she had fought for, dreamed about, and planned for. Then, everything went black. When Chloe regained consciousness, the first thing she noticed was the sterile, unforgiving scent of antiseptic that filled her nostrils. It wasn't the warm, familiar air of her home. nor the comforting smell of her husband's cologne. It was cold, clinical, a stark reminder that something was deeply wrong. As her senses returned, the harsh overhead lights of a hospital room greeted her, and her heart sank as the reality of her situation began to settle in. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. Her body felt heavy, as though every muscle had been drained of energy. The pain in her abdomen was a dull ache, a constant reminder of the trauma she had just endured. And then she heard the soft, familiar voice of Mark, her husband. "Chloe, you're awake," Mark said, his voice trembling slightly, as if he, too, were struggling to hold it together. She turned her head toward him, finding him sitting beside her, his face drawn with concern. His normally composed demeanor was shattered, replaced by the raw edges of worry. "What happened?" Chloe croaked, her throat dry and hoarse. The memories of the grocery store, the officer's hands on her, the overwhelming pain, everything rushed back in fragments. But there was something missing. Something vital. Mark's face darkened, his eyes filled with an expression she couldn't read at first. There was a moment of silence before he finally spoke, his voice breaking. "Chloe, we couldn't save him. We lost the baby." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't comprehend what he was saying. She shook her head, her body trembling, as tears began to well up in her eyes. No, that can't be right. I was just dreaming about him, about our future, about everything we've planned." Her voice cracked with each word, the weight of her grief settling into her chest like a heavy stone. Mark reached for her hand, his grip gentle yet firm, as if trying to ground her in this moment, to offer some semblance of comfort amidst the devastation. "I'm so sorry, Chloe. This isn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." But Chloe couldn't hear him. The crushing wave of guilt, of sorrow, swept over her, leaving her feeling numb. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice, advocating for those who had been wronged. And yet, here she was, unable to protect her own child from the brutality of the system she had fought so hard to change. How could she have let this happen? How could she have failed him? Days turned into weeks, and the grief weighed heavily on Chloe's heart. The miscarriage wasn't just the loss of a child. It was a stark reminder of the brokenness of the system that she had dedicated her life to fighting. The officer's actions, the lack of accountability, the failure of the system to protect her and her child, it all collided, leaving her feeling more lost than she had ever felt before. But as the darkness of her grief slowly began to recede, Chloe started to realize something. She had a choice. She could retreat into her sorrow, allow herself to be swallowed by the pain, or she could rise up and fight, just as she had always done before. She knew she couldn't bring her son back, but she could make sure his death wasn't in vain. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow through her hospital window, Chloe made her decision. She would fight, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been victims of the same injustice she had faced. She would take on the officer who had taken everything from her, and she would hold him and the system he represented accountable. The time for silence was over. Chloe's decision to fight back wasn't made lightly. The weight of her loss still hung over her, a constant reminder of the child she would never hold, the future she would never see. But as she lay in that hospital room, her mind began to shift from grief to resolve. She couldn't let the officer who had caused her pain escape without facing consequences. She couldn't let this injustice be swept under the rug. The days following her decision were filled with calls, meetings, and paperwork as Chloe, with the support of her attorney, John Carter, began to prepare for what would be a long and difficult legal battle. The emotional toll of the situation was staggering, but Chloe knew she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, for every person whose suffering had been ignored by a system designed to protect the powerful. John, understanding the weight Chloe carried, reassured her every step of the way. "This is going to be tough, Chloe," he said one day as they sat in his office reviewing the case. "But your voice matters. Your story can inspire change." And so, Chloe began to speak out. She contacted activists, connected with organizations fighting against police brutality, and poured herself into writing about her experience. The more she shared her story, the more others came forward with their stories of similar injustices, of lives ruined by the same system Chloe had fought her whole career to change. As the case gained attention, Chloe's resolve only grew. She wasn't just a victim. She was a warrior, now more determined than ever to make sure no one else would endure what she had. The fight ahead was uncertain, and the road was long. But Chloe knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to back down. The battle was just beginning. As weeks passed, Chloe's story continued to gain momentum. The news outlets picked up the case, and soon, her name became synonymous with the fight against police brutality and systemic racism. Rallies and protests erupted in Riverside, with people from all walks of life standing by her side. They held signs demanding justice, not just for Chloe, but for every person who had been wronged by the very system that was supposed to protect them. But the fight in the courtroom loomed large. The legal team worked tirelessly, piecing together the case, preparing to expose the truth behind the officer's actions. Chloe found herself in endless meetings, discussing strategies and evidence, and reflecting on the many layers of injustice she had witnessed throughout her career. But this case, this fight, was different. It was personal. It wasn't just about law anymore. It was about her family, her future, and the loss of her unborn child. As the day of the trial drew nearer, Chloe's anxiety grew. She was ready, but no amount of preparation could ease the raw emotions that swelled within her. She wasn't just going to stand before a jury to seek justice for herself. She was going to relive the darkest day of her life in front of a room full of strangers and expose the system that had failed her. On the morning of the trial, Chloe stood before the mirror, her reflection staring back at her with a mixture of weariness and strength. Her face was tired from sleepless nights, but in her eyes, there was a fire. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a voice for those who had been silenced, a symbol of the resilience and power that could rise from even the deepest pain. Mark stood by her side as she left their home that morning, offering nothing more than a quiet look of understanding and love. There were no words needed between them. His support, his presence, was all she needed. He had been her rock through it all, and now they would face this battle together. The courtroom was filled with anticipation. Reporters jostled for position outside, eager for a glimpse of the trial that was becoming a national symbol for the fight against police misconduct. As Chloe entered the room, the tension was palpable. She could feel every eye on her. And though she had stood in countless courtrooms throughout her career, this was different. Today, she was the one seeking justice. The prosecution's opening statement laid bare the gravity of the case. Chloe's attorney, John, spoke passionately, outlining the events that had led to Chloe's assault and the miscarriage she had suffered as a result. He didn't just describe what happened that day. He connected it to the broader issues of racial profiling, police brutality, and the unchecked power of law enforcement. This is not just about one officer, John said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. This is about a system that allows individuals like Officer Alex Thompson to act with impunity, to strip a pregnant woman of her dignity and cause her irreparable harm. Chloe's heart raced as she sat there, listening to John's words. The fight ahead would be long, and it would be hard, but in this moment, she knew she wasn't alone. Her story had become a rallying cry for justice, and she would use it to push forward. As the trial unfolded, Chloe began to see how deep the corruption ran. The defense team, relying on familiar tactics, tried to discredit her, to paint her as an angry, defiant black woman who had somehow provoked the officer's actions. But Chloe held firm. She knew the truth, and she knew the people who had witnessed the attack would back her up. The day the officer, Alex Thompson, took the stand, Chloe's stomach churned. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. But seeing him there cold, irrepentant, and lying through his teeth was almost too much to bear. He claimed that he had acted in self-defense, that he had feared for his safety. But Chloe knew better. When it was John's turn to cross-examine him, the courtroom held its breath. John's questions were sharp, calculated, and unrelenting. He forced Officer Thompson to admit that he had ignored Chloe's pleas, that he hadn't even noticed she was pregnant when he first confronted her. In that moment, Chloe knew she had won a small victory. The truth had been exposed, and she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been wrongly accused, falsely profiled, and silenced by those in power. As the days of the trial dragged on, Chloe's resolve only grew. The emotional toll was immense, but she knew that this was bigger than her personal pain. This was a fight for justice, for accountability, and for a future where her son's life, had he been born, could have been one of hope, not fear. And as the closing arguments neared, Chloe found a renewed sense of strength. No matter what happened in that courtroom, she would continue to fight for her son, for herself, and for everyone who had suffered in silence. The battle was not over, but Chloe was ready for whatever came next. The final day of the trial arrived with a heavy sense of inevitability. The courtroom buzzed with an intensity that had been building for weeks. Reporters crowded outside the courthouse, their cameras flashing as they sought the perfect shot of the person at the center of this landmark case. Activists gathered in solidarity, holding signs that demanded justice, not just for Chloe, but for everyone who had suffered at the hands of law enforcement. Chloe felt the weight of the moment in her chest, her heart pounding with the knowledge that today, everything she had fought for would come to a head. The loss of her child, the assault, the miscarriage, it had all led to this singular point in time. But more than that, it was a chance to make the world see what had happened, to hold the system accountable for the suffering it had caused, and to ensure no one else would have to face what she had. As she sat in the courtroom, her thoughts were a storm of emotion, rage, sorrow, and determination. Her eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on the defense table where Officer Alex Thompson sat. His expression was unreadable, a stark contrast to the raw emotions Chloe was feeling. She couldn't help but wonder how he could sit there so calmly, knowing the destruction his actions had caused. The trial was about to enter its final phase, the closing arguments. John Carter stood up, his presence commanding as he prepared to deliver his last words to the jury. Chloe could see the effort it took for him to maintain his composure. This case had been personal for him as well. He believed in Chloe, in her fight for justice. She could feel his unwavering support, and it gave her strength. John's voice rang out with conviction as he addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what happened to Ms. Brooks that day was not an accident. It wasn't an isolated event. It was a direct result of systemic issues that have been allowed to fester within our law enforcement. Officer Thompson did not see Chloe Brooks as a person, as a mother, as an individual who deserved dignity and respect. He saw her as a threat. Chloe's heart swelled with pride. She could feel the truth in John's words, each one carefully chosen, weighted with the urgency of her case. She was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the countless others who had suffered the same injustice. John continued, his words gaining strength. What happened to Chloe is a tragedy. Yes, but it is also a symptom of a larger problem, a problem that we can no longer ignore. If we allow Officer Thompson to walk away from this without consequence, we are sending a message that this kind of behavior is acceptable. We are saying that it's okay to dehumanize someone simply because of the color of their skin. The room was silent, the weight of John's argument pressing down on everyone present. Chloe could see the jury's faces, their expressions shifting as they listened. She knew the gravity of the decision they had to make, and it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. The defense, however, was not willing to go down without a fight. Officer Thompson's attorney stood and began his argument with a practiced coolness, trying to shift the blame onto Chloe, portraying her as the aggressor. What happened to Ms. Brooks is tragic. Yes, he said with an air of indifference. But Officer Thompson was simply doing his job. He acted in the heat of the moment, as any reasonable officer would when faced with a potentially dangerous situation. Chloe's stomach turned as the defense lawyer continued to twist the narrative, trying to paint her as an unreasonable woman who had somehow escalated the situation. The anger that had been simmering inside her rose once again. But she held it in. This wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving the truth. The defense continued to hammer home the idea that the officer was only doing what he believed was necessary. Law enforcement officers are trained to make split-second decisions, the lawyer argued. Sometimes those decisions may not be perfect, but they are made with the safety of everyone in mind. Chloe's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't just a passive victim in this moment. She was fighting back. She had done everything right. She had been calm. She had explained she was pregnant. And still, they had attacked her, stripped her of her dignity, and taken the life of her unborn child. John rose to counter the defense, his voice even but forceful. This isn't about one mistake. This isn't about a split-second decision. This is about a man who saw a black woman, a pregnant woman, and decided that she was a threat. He ignored her pleas for mercy. He ignored the humanity of her situation. He abused his power, and the consequences of that decision are devastating. The closing arguments concluded, and the jury was sent to deliberate. Chloe sat still, her hands trembling slightly as she waited. She felt exhausted, emotionally drained, but there was a quiet determination in her heart. No matter what happened, she had made her stand. She had exposed the truth. She had made sure the world saw what had been done to her, and she was ready to fight on, no matter the outcome. As the hours passed and the courtroom waited for the jury's verdict, Chloe couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. From the moment she had first been confronted by Officer Thompson to this final moment in the courtroom, she had been pushed to her limits. She had fought not only for justice for herself, but for the countless others who had faced similar brutality and systemic injustice. Finally, the knock on the door came. The jury had reached their decision. Chloe's heart raced as she rose to her feet, her palms sweaty and her breath shallow. This was the moment that would decide everything. In the weeks following the trial, Chloe became a symbol for justice. Her victory brought attention to the broader issues of police brutality and systemic racism. People from across the country reached out, sharing their own stories, and Chloe used her platform to amplify their voices. Though the verdict had brought some peace, it couldn't erase the pain of losing her child or the trauma of the assault. The community in Riverside continued to rally around her, with protests and town halls demanding police reform. Chloe attended these events, understanding that her fight was just beginning. Every march and every conversation about change fueled her determination to continue pushing for accountability. At home, Chloe and Mark shared a quiet grief. The empty nursery was a constant reminder of what they had lost, but it also became a place of reflection, where they began to imagine a new future together. Though the pain was still present, Chloe found strength in their bond and in the community that stood by her side. She knew that her journey wasn't over. She would keep fighting for justice, using her story to ignite change. Her son's memory would live on through the work she did, ensuring that no one else would have to endure the same injustice. The road ahead was long, but Chloe was ready. As Chloe's advocacy work continued to grow, the impact of her case began to ripple through the nation. Her name became synonymous with the fight against police brutality, but she refused to be seen only as a victim. She was determined to shape the conversation around justice and equality. Every speech, every interview, and every article she wrote was a step toward the change she had been fighting for long before the tragedy in that grocery store. Her activism led her to meet with lawmakers and community leaders, pushing for meaningful reforms in police practices. She advocated for better training, more transparent accountability, and policies that could prevent the kind of encounter that had nearly destroyed her life. It was slow work, but Chloe knew that real change didn't come quickly. It required years of effort, and she was ready for the long haul. But the emotional toll of her journey was ever present. Chloe often found herself reliving the pain, especially when faced with moments of public scrutiny or when she saw the countless other victims of police violence who had not received justice. It was a heavy burden to carry, but Chloe had always been a fighter. She had fought for the marginalized her entire career. And now, she would fight for herself and for those who couldn't fight back. In the quiet moments at home, Mark was her anchor. They had grown stronger through their shared grief, each finding ways to heal together while carrying the weight of the past. The pain of losing their child still haunted them, but they knew they had each other, and that was something no injustice could take away. Chloe's work was becoming a movement, one that reached beyond her personal story and into the lives of countless others who had been silenced. She wasn't just fighting for the memory of her son. She was fighting for a future where every child could grow up without fear of being judged by the color of their skin. As her legal work continued and her advocacy expanded, Chloe felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a witness to injustice. She was a force pushing for change, and she would not stop until justice was served for all. Chloe's journey had come full circle. What had started as a personal tragedy, an assault that had taken her child and shaken her faith in the system, had transformed into a powerful movement. She was no longer just the woman who had fought for justice in the courtroom. She had become a beacon for others who had suffered at the hands of the law. Chloe's story was now one of resilience, one of strength, and one of unyielding determination to change the system that had failed her. Her advocacy work reached new heights. She became a key figure in national conversations about police reform, her voice echoing through protests, policy discussions, and community events. Laws began to shift. Small but significant changes started to take root, and the public's awareness of systemic racism was growing. It was a slow process, but with Chloe leading the charge, there was a sense of hope that change was possible. But no matter how far her influence reached, the grief of losing her child never left her. It had become a part of her, woven into the very fabric of her fight. Chloe had learned to live with it, to channel it into something greater than herself. But there were still moments, quiet, private moments, when the pain would resurface, raw and unrelenting. Mark continued to be her rock, and together, they began to heal. Their shared loss would always be a part of their story, but their bond had only grown stronger. They had found strength in each other, in their shared mission, and in the community that surrounded them. The trial had been a turning point. It had given Chloe the platform she needed to spark real conversations. But her true work had only just begun. She had no illusions about the fight ahead. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to expose, and more voices to lift up. But Chloe knew she was no longer alone. She had built a network of allies, activists, and leaders who were as committed to justice as she was. And so, Chloe's fight continued, not just for the memory of her son, but for the future of every child who deserved to grow up in a world free from fear. A world where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality for all. Her journey had been long, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But with each passing day, Chloe walked forward with renewed strength, knowing that the change she had fought for was within reach. Her son's memory lived on, not just in the fight she led, but in the future she was helping to create, a future where no one else would have to endure the same pain she had faced. And as she looked ahead, Chloe knew one thing for sure: the fight for justice, for equality, and for a better world was worth every step. Thank you for joining us and hearing Chloe Brooks' powerful and emotional journey. Her story reminds us of the resilience required to confront injustice and the courage needed to stand against systemic wrongs. We hope this account inspires reflection, empathy, and a shared commitment to change. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to help spread awareness. Together, we can ensure voices like Chloe's continue to resonate and inspire action. Thank you for watching.